Okay, I want to keep this intro short and sharp here so that we can get into the chess analysis. So the reason this video is titled as it is because a few days back now, a lady called Yosha released a video, screenshot on screen, and she presented Gambit Man's analysis, which showed that Hans Niemann had a whole bunch of games which looked really suspicious in terms of their engine game correlation. Some of them were as high as 100%. He actually had quite a few of them which I've been analysing. So this is one of them. I believe it's the longest one at 45 moves. So I want to show you this beautiful game. And just a note on the actual data here. So for me right now, I can't yet trust this data because I don't fully understand the methodology that's been applied to actually obtain the data, and I don't know if that methodology has been applied consistently across all players and across all games. So if someone could demonstrate to me exactly how this methodology is applied and that it was done fairly and consistently, then I could start to get behind it and use it as serious evidence to pin down Hans Niemann or any other player for that matter when it comes to cheating. Clearly it's very, very valuable data, but it has to be done properly, it has to be controlled. Personally, I'm not willing to start nailing someone at this point based on this when I don't know the truth of the source at this stage. So that's just me. I've reached out to Yosha, asked her for more information about this, not yet heard back. Also asked if maybe she'd want to do a live stream, answer some questions, etc. But okay, not heard back as of yet. So let's see what happened. Pawn to e4 played. c5 now from Hans's opponent, which was a grandmaster, Christian Camilo Rios. Now knight f3, knight c6, and Hans doesn't go for d4, the open Sicilian here. He goes knight c3 instead. Now we had e5 from black, so they immediately clamp on this d4 move, make it impossible. Didn't have to do that, you could have gone e6, g6, different options. But this one now creates this positional battle, a strategic battle for the control of d5. So bishop c4 was played here, immediately developing onto that diagonal. d6 now played, d3, and now knight f6 didn't come first, or then knight g5 comes and there's problems with the f7's pawn here. So bishop e7 was played first, covers that knight jump, and now this is really nice from Hans. He doesn't play this casual castles move, instead he goes for knight d2, immediately rerouting this knight, so it's coming round like this into the d5 square. So now knight f6, knight f1, and now black throws in this bishop g4 to disrupt some of the white setup. You could go queen d2 to avoid weakening your pawns, but it's a bit ugly, sits in front of your bishop. So f3 was played instead, the bishop drops back, and black's arguing that they've created some weaknesses here. So white goes knight to e3. You don't want to start taking here. Yes, you double the pawns, but then black covers this d5 square. Now we had castles from both players, and now black has to come up with some kind of plan here. It's not so easy to make a pawn break. For example, d5 is clamped. So knight d7 was played, and there's a positional idea behind this. Again, it's around control of d5. Black wants bishop g5, then eliminating that knight on e3. So Hans now hops his knight in. This knight comes back to b6, challenging the square. Hans now goes c3, and we'll see the point of that in a moment. It covers the d4 square from this knight, and now we get this whole sequence of moves after bishop's g5, and now Hans trades on b6 here, and he's heading for this simplification where he leaves himself with the better pawn structure. So he takes on e6 there, looks counterintuitive because you now plug that square, but after queen to b3, you can see the problems that black has trying to defend these weak pawns. So black wants d5 here to start to liberate the position, get that backwards pawn going. You could do it immediately, it gets quite tactical. Then you've got to calculate things like takes first or knight g4 immediately, different lines going on. So black didn't want any part, they just chop off that knight on e3, bishop recaptures, and then they push pawn to d5 here. And Hans doesn't capture, he just waits on the position. He goes pawn a3, this a file is open, that pawn could be a liability later on, and now you can't push d4 yet, you lose here with check. So instead black goes knight to a5, kicks the queen into b5, and then develops the queen to c7, connecting the rooks. But this is a risky way to play because you now put your knight on the edge of the board, and Hans said he already considered playing pawn to b4 here, but then he couldn't quite make this knight b3 stuff work. If he moves the rook here, rook takes here, he was trying to make the tactics work, but he said he couldn't. So instead of pushing b4 immediately, he brings this rook across. Now preparing b4, the rook would cover b3. So black now goes d4, looks for a counterpunch, and now the bishop drops back to f2. You don't want to take, by the way, or you help repair the structure. This pawn's no longer a weakness here. So the bishop drops back. Very often now it's bouncing around here to target this pawn, and now queen c6 was played, and Hans doesn't trade on c6 because you just help the knight come back into the game, defend these weaknesses. So a4 played instead. Black trades queens, the pawn recaptures, and now this knight has no retreat square. It can come into b3, which looks quite logical here. Say rook captures, rook takes back, but the problem is this bishop's g3 move, and you just can't defend that pawn, and once that one drops, well then the bishop could be coming here, targeting this pawn, and the whole dark squared chain starts to become really weak. This is the problem. Hans also talked about a line here about potentially going c4, trying to trap this knight because it hasn't got really an escape route, can never get back to c6, although it doesn't quite work, but it was something he said he considered. Anyway, d takes on c3 was played by black instead, the pawn recaptured, and now the rook comes to the open file. So it targets this pawn, Hans now defends it. Again, if you try knight to b3, it's no good, we trade, then target this pawn. So the knight's still stuck, king f7 was played, maybe one day coming to f6, but now rook a to b1. So that knight's not coming to b3 anytime soon. c4 is going to be the only way to try and break it out of the box here. But first rook d6 from black, preparing to double, attack this pawn. So Hans brings the king over, now pawn to c4 to break out that knight, but pawn d4, counter strike, pawn captures, and this bishop is opened up. Dominant piece in the center here, looking at this pawn, looking at this pawn, and black's actually got problems dealing with both of those pawns. So we see the king coming to e7 here, for the reason being that say you try knight b3 now, well then white can actually win this pawn, because after rook recaptures, you lose this rook on the back rank. This is the problem here. So that's why the knight doesn't come to b3 immediately, and it's why the king steps to e7. Because now if you capture this pawn, well then you can take here, and now if takes here, well the king recaptures. You've covered that rook on the back rank. This is the key. But Hans doesn't have to take on b6. Now he can take on g7, so this is what he does. He snaps that one off. But black takes here, rook recaptures, and this is the idea. You pick up a tempo on the bishop, then you crash through with check, forcing the king up. Looks like great counterplay, but the problem is you're actually forcing the king up into this kind of danger zone. This is still a dominant bishop, this is still a bad piece, and if these pawns fall, well this b pawn is going to be a monster. But this is really nice calculation. So after rook to b2, that pawn's attacked, and it can't be defended with your own rook. But this is the sequence that saves the pawn. So bishop d6 check, the king goes, and then you come back, blocking the rook's attack. Really nice stuff as well, because now when the rook takes here, yes, you did leave the defense of that pawn, but white now invades and is just mopping up these pawns, and then the b pawn is really going to decide the game. So knight b3, it breaks out of the box, rook takes on b6, knight to a1, threatening knight c2 check, so the bishop hops back, hits that rook. Now we had the check, forces the king up, and now because the king's blocked the bishop, the rook's no longer attacked, knight e1 was played, pressuring that f3 pawn, but bishop e5 check, and now the king abandons this pawn here. If you try and stay with it, say you go king to f7, well then we're dropping this one with check. And again, the b pawn's just going to be really deadly. Oh, but you don't go b6 straight away, by the way. This would be a blunder. Then knight d3 check, and you're suddenly blundering an entire bishop. So you'd have to be a bit careful here, but the b pawn should win out. Anyway, so that's why the king didn't come to f7, trying to hold the e6 pawn. Instead it abandoned that one. We had takes with check, king went, rook back to b6, now rook h3, attacking this pawn, hands takes with check, king e6, rook b6 check back, king d7, and bishop d4 was actually now the final move of the game. Black resigned in this position. Now the reason they resigned, even if say you take this one with check, well, you're just driving the king into the game, and once again the problem is this b pawn. I mean, for example, you could check, swing behind the h pawn here, maybe the king even mops up the c4 pawn at the right moment. White just has too many pawns here coming down the board, dominant minor piece, better king, better rook. It's just game over at this elite level. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and if you want to see a fascinating interview now with Hans Niemann analysing this game after it was played, then you can find that on screen here. So I hope you enjoy that one. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.